Theodore Winslow had not been meant to hear it. He had been passing through the second-floor hallway of his Hartford estate on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, moving toward his study with a stack of papers under one arm, when he had noticed Lucy, 4 years old, the daughter of his housekeeper, Adriana, standing very still outside the small linen closet at the end of the hall, her ear turned toward the closed door with the particular careful stillness of a child listening for something specific. He had slowed, uncertain whether to interrupt, and had watched as Lucy turned, noticed him, and crossed the hallway toward him with quiet, deliberate steps, her small face carrying an expression considerably more serious than the ordinary afternoon typically produced. "Mommy is crying again," she whispered, glancing back toward the linen closet door. "In there. She thinks I don't know, but I always know." Theodore had felt something in his chest tighten, the particular discomfort of an employer realizing, with sudden and considerable clarity, that something significant had been happening in his own house without his awareness. "How often does this happen, Lucy?" he asked quietly, crouching to her level. Lucy had considered the question with the specific gravity she brought to information she understood mattered. "A lot," she said. "Since Grandpa died. She goes somewhere small and quiet, like the closet, or the pantry, or the car sometimes, and she cries for a little while, and then she comes out and her face looks normal again, like nothing happened. I'm not supposed to know, but I always know, because I can hear her, even when she's trying to be quiet." Theodore had looked toward the closed closet door, understanding, with a specific, considerable weight, exactly what he was learning, that Adriana, a woman who had worked in his house for over a year with unfailing composure and professionalism, had apparently been carrying a grief so carefully contained that she had constructed, without his ever noticing, an entire private architecture of brief, hidden moments in which to release it, always followed by the specific, practiced return to composure that had allowed her to continue functioning, day after day, without anyone around her fully understanding the weight she carried. "I'm going to wait here with you," Theodore said gently, "until she's ready to come out. We won't interrupt her, but I don't think either of us should pretend we don't know, going forward." Lucy had nodded, apparently relieved to have finally shared the specific, careful watch she had been keeping largely alone. "Should we knock?" she asked. "Or just wait?" "Let's just wait," Theodore said, quietly. "She'll come out when she's ready, and we'll be here." "Hey, welcome back, everyone. I am so glad you are here. This is the place for stories about the grief we carry so carefully that even the people closest to us don't always see it, and the small witnesses who notice anyway. Before we begin, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments. I read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now, because today's story is gentle, and it will remind you that grief deserves room to be felt. Stay until the very end. Let's begin. Hartford carries the specific, quiet gravity of a city built on insurance and finance, its considerable old wealth having accumulated across more than 2 centuries of underwriting risk for a country that had, across that same span, needed the industry considerably more than it had ever fully acknowledged. The city's historic neighborhoods, West End, Asylum Hill, housed families whose fortunes had been built on the particular unglamorous stability of the insurance industry that had made Hartford, for generations, one of the country's most significant financial centers, its wealth considerably quieter and less visible than the flashier industries of larger coastal cities. Theodore Winslow's estate sat in Hartford's West End, a large colonial revival house built in the early 1900s, purchased and restored by Theodore's grandfather. The family's considerable fortune built across 3 generations in the insurance industry that had defined the city's economic identity. Her name was Adriana. Adriana Castellano, 33 years old, Born in Hartford to parents who had emigrated from Italy's Calabria region in the late 1980s, her father working construction for over 2 decades across the city's considerable ongoing development, her mother working as a seamstress from home, the two of them building, across years of careful, physically demanding work, a specific stability they had instilled deeply in Adriana. She had studied hospitality management at the University of Hartford, had worked several years in hotel operations before her daughter's birth, combined with a difficult divorce, had led her toward the more immediately stable work of private household management. She had been managing Theodore Winslow's household for just over a year, work she took considerable pride in, Theodore having proven, across that time, a genuinely reasonable and considerate employer. Her daughter Lucy came with her most days. Adriana's father, Lucy's grandfather, a man named Salvatore who had, across Lucy's short life, become one of her closest and most beloved relatives, the specific warm, patient presence of a grandfather who had genuine time and attention to offer his only grandchild, had died 8 months earlier, a sudden cardiac event that had given the family no warning and no time to prepare, the particular devastating swiftness of a loss that arrives without any of the difficult but at least anticipatory process a longer illness sometimes allows. Lucy was 4 years old. She had her mother's watchful eyes and a specific, developed sensitivity to grief that had, across the 8 months since her grandfather's death, made her considerably more attuned to her mother's emotional patterns than most 4-year-olds typically managed with the adults around them. The particular acuity of a child who had watched someone she loved disappear from her daily life entirely, and who had, in the aftermath, become quietly vigilant about the ways grief continued to move through her remaining family. She had noticed, within the first few weeks after her grandfather's death, that her mother had developed a specific pattern: brief disappearances into small, private spaces, always followed by a careful, deliberate return to her ordinary composed self, the particular performance of someone determined not to let her grief become visible or burdensome to the people depending on her. Lucy had not understood, at first, exactly what she was witnessing. She had understood, gradually, across the following months, that her mother was sad about Grandpa, and that the sadness had somewhere specific it went when it needed to come out, and that her mother believed, incorrectly, that this pattern remained entirely hidden from her daughter's awareness. Hit that like button right now, because a 4-year-old just revealed she'd been quietly, carefully aware of her mother's grief for 8 months, watching a pattern her mother believed was entirely hidden, and finally trusting someone enough to share what she'd been carrying alone. Subscribe right now, because what happens next is going to remind you why grief deserves room to breathe. Let's keep going. Adriana had emerged from the linen closet perhaps 10 minutes later, her composure carefully restored, her eyes only slightly reddened in a way that most casual observers might have attributed to allergies or simple fatigue rather than genuine private grief. She had stopped short upon finding Theodore and Lucy waiting quietly in the hallway. "Mr. Winslow," she said, her voice carrying immediate, considerable alarm. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize anyone was—" "Adriana," Theodore said gently, cutting off the beginning of what he understood would be an apology she did not need to offer. "Lucy told me what's been happening. I want you to know that's all right. You don't need to explain or apologize for anything." Adriana's composure, already fragile from the private moments in the closet, had visibly begun to fracture further, the specific overwhelming vulnerability of someone whose carefully maintained privacy had just been gently, unexpectedly seen. "I didn't want it to affect my work," she said, her voice unsteady. "I didn't want you to think I couldn't manage my responsibilities, or that I needed special accommodation. My father died 8 months ago, and I've been trying to keep that separate from everything else, to just get through the days without it becoming a burden on anyone." "I'm sorry for your loss," Theodore said. And I'm considerably more concerned that you felt you needed to hide this so completely, for 8 months, than I am about any impact it might have had on your work. Your work has been excellent throughout. That was never the issue. Adriana had looked at Lucy, understanding, with a specific, growing weight, exactly how much her daughter had been quietly witnessing across the preceding months. You knew, she said softly, crouching down to Lucy's level. This whole time, you knew, and you never said anything. I didn't want to make you sadder by telling you I knew, Lucy said. I thought if I said something, it would mean you couldn't keep it private anymore, and I thought the privacy was helping you. But then I got worried, because it kept happening, and it didn't seem like it was getting smaller. So I told Mr. Winslow, because I thought maybe he could help, even though I wasn't sure how. Theodore had sat with Adriana and Lucy in the hallway for a considerable time that afternoon, the specific, careful conversation that followed unfolding with a gentleness he had not always known himself capable of extending to household matters he generally managed with more professional distance. Can I ask you something directly, he said, once the initial emotional weight of the moment had settled somewhat. Have you had any real space to grieve your father, beyond these brief private moments you've been managing alone? A funeral, certainly, but beyond that, any actual time to process what happened, without also managing a full-time job and a 4-year-old simultaneously. Adriana had been quiet for a long moment, the specific, honest answer requiring more vulnerability than she had extended to anyone across the preceding 8 months. No, she admitted finally. I took 3 days for the funeral, and then I came back to work, because I needed the income, and because I told myself that grief was something you managed privately, in small moments, rather than something that required actual space. I don't think I ever gave myself permission to feel it fully. I've just been managing it in pieces, whenever I could steal a few minutes alone. That sounds exhausting, Theodore said. I don't think grief was designed to be managed exclusively in stolen moments between responsibilities. I think it needs more room than that, eventually, or it simply accumulates. Share this story right now with someone who needs it today, because a mother had been managing 8 months of genuine grief entirely in stolen moments. A closet, a pantry, a parked car, convincing herself that was enough, until someone finally asked whether she'd ever had actual space to feel it fully. One tap. Send this to someone who needs permission to stop managing their grief in pieces. Let's keep going. Theodore had, in the days that followed, worked through a specific, careful set of changes intended to give Adriana genuine room to grieve, rather than simply continuing to manage the loss in the particular fragmented way she had defaulted to across the preceding months. He had offered her a period of paid bereavement leave, not the standard 3 days most employers considered sufficient, but 2 full weeks, framed explicitly as time she was owed rather than a favor she needed to feel grateful for, along with the specific, genuine assurance that her position and compensation would remain entirely unaffected by the time away. I don't know how to take 2 weeks off, Adriana had said, when he first proposed it. I've never had that kind of space before. I'm not sure what I would even do with it. You don't need a plan for it, Theodore said. You could simply exist in it, without managing anyone's needs but your own and Lucy's, for 2 weeks. Grieve, however, that actually looks for you, whether that's crying, or sitting quietly, or going through your father's things, or simply resting. There's no correct way to use the time. I just want you to have it, without the pressure of also managing a full workday alongside it. He had also connected her, through his own network, with a grief counselor who specialized in sudden loss, a resource Adriana had not previously considered accessing, having believed, across the preceding months, that grief counseling was a resource intended for people whose loss had been more complicated or more visible than her own straightforward, if devastating, sudden bereavement. Lucy had, throughout the following weeks of Adriana's bereavement leave, remained a specific, constant presence beside her mother, the two of them spending considerably more unstructured time together than their ordinary working days typically allowed. Visits to Salvatore's grave, quiet afternoons going through old photographs, the particular slow, necessary work of actually processing a loss rather than simply managing its symptoms in stolen private moments. "I miss him too," Lucy had told her mother during one of these afternoons, looking at a photograph of herself as an infant held in her grandfather's arms. "I used to think I wasn't supposed to be sad because I was little when he died, and I don't remember everything about him. But I think I am sad. I just didn't know where to put it, like you didn't know where to put yours." Adriana had held her daughter close, understanding, with a specific, considerable clarity, that Lucy's grief had been running alongside her own the entire time, similarly unexamined, similarly managed in whatever small private moments a 4-year-old's understanding of grief allowed. "We can be sad together now," Adriana said. "We don't have to hide it from each other anymore." Right here, a mother just discovered that her own 4-year-old had been carrying unexpressed grief alongside her, similarly hidden, similarly unexamined, until 2 weeks of genuine, unhurried space finally gave both of them room to grieve together instead of separately and alone. Share this right now with someone who needs to be reminded that grief shared is considerably lighter than grief carried in isolation. Subscribe because we're almost at the end. Let's finish it. Adriana had returned to her regular work after the 2 weeks of bereavement leave, with a specific, considerable difference visible in her overall demeanor. Not that the grief had resolved entirely, which she understood, with the counselor's guidance, was not how grief actually worked, but that she no longer carried the particular exhausting weight of managing it exclusively in secret, brief, hidden fragments throughout her working days. "I still cry sometimes," she told Theodore, several weeks after returning to her regular schedule. "But I don't hide it in the closet anymore. Lucy knows it's happening, and that's all right now. I think I understand, finally, that letting the grief be visible didn't make me less capable. It just made it more honest." "I think you were always capable," Theodore said. "I don't think anyone watching your work across the preceding 8 months would have described you as anything other than excellent at your job. I think the hiding was never actually necessary, even though I understand completely why it felt that way at the time." Lucy, throughout this entire gradual shift, had continued her particular careful attentiveness to her mother's emotional state, though the specific quality of that attentiveness had changed considerably. No longer the anxious, secret monitoring of a child watching for a pattern she believed she needed to protect her mother from revealing, but something closer to genuine, shared companionship, the two of them navigating an ongoing loss together rather than separately and in hiding. "Do you still check on me?" Adriana asked her daughter once, with a small, warm smile. "The way you used to, listening outside the closet door?" "Sometimes," Lucy admitted. "But now I just come sit with you, instead of just listening from outside. I think that's better. Mr. Winslow taught me that. He said we shouldn't pretend we don't know things, and that waiting together is better than waiting alone. There is a particular kind of grief that becomes, through no fault of the person carrying it, considerably heavier than it needs to be. The specific, exhausting practice of managing genuine loss in stolen, private fragments, convinced that visibility equals burden, that composure equals capability, that the people depending on you require your grief to remain entirely hidden in order to trust your continued reliability. Adriana Castellano had carried her father's death exactly this way for 8 months, constructing an entire private architecture of brief, hidden moments in which to release what she believed needed to stay contained, never fully understanding, until a 4-year-old finally broke the careful silence, exactly how much her own daughter had been quietly watching and worrying alongside her the entire time. It took Lucy's simple, whispered observation, "Mommy is crying again," delivered not as an accusation or even fully as a request for help, but as the honest, uncomplicated sharing of something she had been carrying alone for considerably longer than any 4-year-old should have to finally break through the careful architecture Adriana had built around her own grief. Sometimes the people who notice our most carefully hidden pain are not the ones we expect, and the permission we need to finally let grief be visible arrives not through grand intervention, but through someone small enough and honest enough to simply say what they've seen. If today's story moved you, please hit that like button right now. It costs you 1 second, and it sends this to someone who needs it today. Subscribe because there are more stories coming. More grief carried more heavily than it needs to be. More small witnesses who notice what we believe we've hidden completely. Share this today with someone who might be managing their own loss in stolen, private moments, in case today is the day they finally get permission to let it be visible. If you are navigating grief yourself, please know that support is available, and reaching out for it is never a sign of weakness. And I will see you in the next one.